Namo Guru Manjushri. Namo Buddhaya. Namo Dharmaya. Namo Sanghaya. So, what is study? What are we talking about when we talk about study? Dhamma study, that is. Some of you know that I quite often use a distinction that Coleridge made, the great English poet and thinker, between what he called the concept of a thing and the idea of a thing. So the concept of a thing is a description of its, as it were, physical characteristics. It's what enables you to recognize it when you see it. And the idea of a thing is what its ultimate goal and purpose is. So what is the concept of Dhamma study that we're going to be talking about? It's taking a text, either a scriptural text, that is a text that purports to be recording the words of the Buddha, or a commentary, perhaps by one of those who are reputed to be enlightened disciples of the Buddha, and engaging with it, trying to grapple with it, understand it. We'll see more what that means in a while. So that's the concept of Dhamma study. What is the idea of Dhamma study? What is the ultimate goal and purpose of Dhamma study? I'm not going to answer this directly. How can I? I've got to fill 40 minutes. But I'm going to answer it by looking at what seems to me to be, and I don't think this is very arguable, the origin of Dhamma study in the world. The first Dhamma study took place in Sarnath, where the Buddha preached what we know of as the Dhammachakkha Pavatana Sutta. And when we look at what happens there in that sutta, we see, I think, quite clearly what Dhamma study is about. I'm not going to use the sutta versions of the text. I'm going to look at the version in the Vinaya, in the Mahavagga, which gives a slightly fuller and richer account of what happened at that first teaching of the Dhamma. We have to go back to see the story all the way through to the Bodhi tree, or rather to the vicinity of the Bodhi tree. In fact, we have to go back to the Ajapala Nigrodha, very important tree which is marked by a pillar at the foot of the long steps down to the level of the Mahabodhi temple, for those of you who know Bodh Gaya. There's an Ashokan period pillar there. Several important things happened there. The Gharava Sutta was preached there. The confrontation with Brahmanism took place there. But most famously, what took place there is that the Buddha grappled with the question of whether to teach or not. Of course, this is all told in mythological terms, and I believe that the text it comes from is said to be quite early. But the Buddha is first of all considers that it's just not possible to communicate what he's realized. This is quite important for understanding what Dhamma study is about. The Buddha has seen something which he says has not been seen before, and that no one living, he can see no one living who has achieved this, who's matched this. And he believes that people are too much immersed in worldly craving. They're caught up in everything that binds us into ordinary life. They're just completely trapped in it. And it's self-enclosing, so that when you're trapped in all of that, you can't hear what somebody's saying from another dimension, because your boundaries are the limits of your own thinking, if you see what I mean. So that it's automatically self-enclosing. So the Buddha thinks, what possibility is there of communicating? And it would just be tiresome for me. I put a lot of effort into it. I wouldn't get anywhere. I'm paraphrasing. It's not what the sutta says. But this is what it comes down to. And it's just not worth it. We're told, of course, at that point that the great god Brahma Sahampati, the Lord of 1,000 worlds, a very big god indeed, appears at that point and pleads with him to teach, saying that there are beings with but little dust in their eyes. And the Buddha again just says, it's just not possible, it's not going to work. That, of course, happens 3 times. And then the Buddha surveys the world, and of course this is where the famous metaphor of the lotus pond comes in, where he sees beings, some who are buried in the mud, as it were, some who are beginning to push up through the water, and some who are a little bit open, clear of the water. He sees some beings who have sharp intelligence, are ready to understand, a little bit open, and these are the people that he must start with. This he realizes, he tells Brahma Sahampati and declares that the doors of the deathless are open, which is a very, very important moment for us. If it wasn't for that, we would not be here. So that's important already. What we've looked at already is significant. It's not at all easy for the Buddha to get through to us. It's not at all easy for us to receive the Buddha because we're enclosed in our craving and in everything that our craving engenders. Our very existence is the consequence of craving. We've taken birth because of craving. That is the house builder. And the extraordinary thing about craving is that, and the world that the craving creates, is that it stops us from looking at reality. There's one of the best passages in Schopenhauer in The World as Will and Representation. It's an exploration of suffering. Really second to none, I think. I strongly recommend it, where he looks at the way in which, even though our experience again and again and again is telling us this does not work, we suppress that knowledge and we go on looking because it all makes sense in terms of what we already know and what we already are, as it were. It's all set up to continue. So hold that in your mind. It's really difficult. It's difficult for the Buddha to get through to us, and it's difficult for us to let the Buddha in. So the Buddha, exhorted by Brahma Sahampati, who of course is overjoyed that the world is not going to be left in suffering, he thinks, who can I teach? I may not need my crib. So he immediately thinks of his 2 former teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputra. Remember, both of them, at the end of his time with them, offered him the equal seat. Both of them said to him, you know what we know. Well, each of them said, you know what I know. You share the leadership of this group of disciples with me. So in other words, they respected him, they honored him, and they recognized that he'd gone as far as they had. So that's quite important. We'll see that a bit later. So the Buddha thinks, well, I'll tell them. They're of sharp intelligence, each of them in sequence. They're of sharp intelligence, they've got little dust, they will understand. He's then told by a deva that unfortunately each of them has passed away, as it happens very, very recently, that night I think it is. Seems very inconvenient of reality, but they're not available. So then he thinks, well, who else is there? And he thinks of the 5 bhikkhus. They're called bhikkhus because bhikkhu at this stage didn't have its technical monastic meaning. It just meant a wanderer, a beggar, an alms person, a friar. And he thinks of them, and he thinks, well, they're of sharp intelligence. Interesting, the phrase that's used. I don't know what the Pali is, I didn't look it up, but they're of quick intelligence. Quick, I think, yes, I did look it up. It's quick. They can grasp quickly. And they have little dust, and they supported me and helped me. So that's again quite significant. When they'd been practicing together, the Buddha had effectively been their leader. And they'd looked up to him and followed him. His teaching had guided them. And they'd seen him as ahead of them. Again, this is important. So the Buddha says, well, they're of sharp intelligence, they've got little dust, they're receptive, and they are receptive to me. So he sees with his divine eye, his divya chakshu, that they are at Isipatana, at Sarnath, and he walks from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath. It would take about 2 days, according to Google Maps. I can even tell you the route, but not easy. And he arrives at the deer park, and he comes to where he sees the 5 bhikkhus, and famously, they see him coming, and they agree amongst themselves that they will only accord him slight respect, if you see what I mean. They'll accord him conventional courtesy, but no more than that. They will not get up and greet him. They will not take his robe and bowl, which is what you do with an honored person. They will not give him a seat. They will not give him water, and so on. And that's their decision. They've decided that the Buddha has quit. He's gone soft because he took food and left the path of tapasya, of extreme asceticism. And they therefore think that he's not on the path. Again, this is important. We'll come back to this in a moment. But as the Buddha approaches, they're not able to keep their resolve. Presumably, there's something about the Buddha, it's not stated, but presumably there's something about the Buddha that is so impressive that they cannot but accord him honor. And in fact, the sutta, or the text, goes into a fair bit of detail about it. They, for instance, give him a seat and give him a footstool for his feet so he can wash them. And then they give him water for washing his feet. It doesn't happen so much now, but I've had this happen to me. If you go to an Indian house and when they greet you, there will be a little low stool and you stand on that and they wash your feet. It doesn't say they washed his feet, he washed them himself, but they made something ready so he didn't just wash his feet in the mud. And there's a seat, and they set a seat for him. Before they'd said, we'll leave a seat for him, and if he wants to sit down, he can. But they actually get him to sit, and they make him welcome. And then they start talking with him, but they talk to him respectfully, but as to an equal. They use the word avuso, which is usually translated as a friend, and it's apparently commonly used amongst bhikshus of a similar ordination date. They're not looking up to somebody, they call them Bhante. If they're of equal status, they'll call each other friend. So they refer to the Buddha like that. It's not rudely, it's just without according him any special honor. So the Buddha says, don't call me that. Don't call me that, because I am the Tathagata. I am an Arahat. I am completely free. I'm a Tathagata. I'm a Sambuddha. I've seen the truth. I've fulfilled that for which someone leaves home. I fulfilled the Dhamma life. Immediately, the Buddha refuses to be brought down to their level. Because as soon as he's allowed them to bring him down to his level, he can't communicate. You must experience this yourself, even in your own world. If you make too many concessions to people and greet them on their own level, you can never get up to another level. You can never take things on to another level unless you're really skillful about it. So the Buddha refuses. He will not be brought down. So the first issue we have is about respect, is about them seeing him as the Buddha and being prepared to accept him as the Buddha. So they say, we can't call you that. We can't regard you in that way because you've quit. You've given up the spiritual life. Because you're living a life of luxury, a handful of rice and a robe and so forth. But you've quit. You've left the path of tapasya. And so immediately, what we're up against is a view. This is very important. In fact, until I looked at this in preparation for this retreat, I hadn't really realized how many fascinating sort of clues there are in the text itself. But they've got a view. Their view is that freedom lies in, as it were, suppressing all desire. Suppressing, that's important. They think that if you mortify the body and you triumph over the body's desires, if you force your mind to remain still and free, if you force it, that's an important point, then you will gain freedom. And this is still a widespread belief in Indian religion. Widespread. So they've got a view about what spiritual life is. So when they see the Buddha, from the point of view of their view, the Buddha's gone off. He's not on track. So they can't hear him. They can't listen to him. And the first thing the Buddha has to do is to get them, even to listen to him enough to be able to get them free from their view. So he asserts again and again, I am the Buddha, etc. They again and again say, look, you've quit. And then the Buddha says, have you ever heard me make this sort of claim before? Again, very, very interesting. He's appealing to their personal knowledge of him. They'd known him closely as their leader, and presumably they'd known him to be a deeply honest and sincere man. They'd known that he would not say something if he did not believe it, if he did not know it from himself, if you see what I mean. So he's able, in this circumstance, to appeal to their personal knowledge of him. This sort of wins them round, and they stop calling him Avuso, and they call him Bhante. Again, buried in the text. If you don't look at the Pali, you won't notice it. But they change their way of referring to him. So they call him Bhadante, which means venerable one, worthy one, honored one, and Bhadanta. And so they've crossed a line. They've entered into a receptive state in relation to him. You can see the relevance of this to study. We'll come back to that later. But they're now willing to listen. And the Buddha, first of all, tells them about the middle way. So he disabuses them of their wrong view. He gets rid of their view of the spiritual life as consisting in the suppression of all bodily urge and desire, and mental urge and desire. Forcibly. He gets rid of that by teaching the middle way between luxury and excess and extreme asceticism. And he teaches them the middle path, the Eightfold Way. So they can at last see a way forward that leads to nirvana that does not consist in self-mortification. Of course, it doesn't consist in luxury either. So he's got rid of their wrong views. He's got them a little bit clear of the view that they've been practicing on for years, that he'd been practicing on, presumably for years, and that it made it difficult for them to really take him at all seriously. And they open to him. They're pleased by what he has to say. It's revealing to them. And presumably this is all a human communication. It's not a formal lecture or something like that. There's interaction, which is all missing from the text. It's not able to be put there. In fact, so much is missing from the text. But presumably, they're sitting, they're talking, there's interaction. It's not just the Buddha speaking and them saying, yes, sir, no, sir. A bit like, the Socratic dialogues where the interlocutor just says, yes, Socrates, no, Socrates, you're right, Socrates. Or poor old Subhuti in the Dharma Sutra. Have you ever read that play by Alfred Jarry, which consists simply in the answers to Socratic questions? Anyway, the absurdist drama. But must be much more than that going on. They must have been questioning, they must have been asking, they must have been, what about this, what about that? But the Buddha's able to clarify things for them so that they can see that asceticism of itself is not the path. Then he reveals to them the Four Noble Truths, so the text says. Again, we don't really know what he said, but the Four Noble Truths presumably are a good encapsulation of the communication that he had with them. I'm not going to go into all of that because it's well known to us, but he goes into it in considerable depth and detail. And again, the text is very formulaic, but one imagines this is the first time the Buddha's actually tried to teach. And I presume that he's sort of working things out as he's teaching. It's all revealing itself in the course of his communication, as things do. And first of all, Kondanya gets it. He realizes what the Buddha is saying. And he says he's realized that whatever is of a nature to arise is of a nature to cease. And he enters the stream. And so the Buddha is, of course, absolutely delighted. And not only the Buddha, but all the gods, all the way up to the highest God realm, back down again, rejoice. Something really spectacular has happened. A communication of the enlightened state has begun to take place. A decisive moment has been passed. Then the Buddha engages with the others, and the text says nothing about what that engagement consists in, but one can well imagine it was a quite strenuous discussion in which what the text does reveal is that the Buddha does sort of ask them questions. Have you seen this? Have you recognized this? If it's like that, is this the case? And so on. He's taking them with him. He's engaging with them and helping them to come with him. And slowly, one after another, they cross the line. They gain stream entry. This is taking place over several days. The text isn't clear about how long it all takes. And I did look at the commentary, but I can't remember what it says. But it's a matter of days. And Some of them are going into Benares, presumably, to gather alms food, while the others are in this very deep, intensive study group with the Buddha, this seminar with the Buddha, in which he is trying to get across to them what he has realized. Well, it's so difficult for them to see because they're in their bubble, in their carapace of self, which they can't see beyond. And but one after another, they get it. Once they've all got it, the Buddha steps the pace up, and he now gives them a teaching on anatta and the selfless nature of the skandhas. In other words, a 5 skandha practice or a 6 element practice. He takes them through a practice, and again, he's asking them all the time, is there anything in rupa that you can call self? No. Is there anything in Vedana? So forth. So he's not just sort of telling them, he's getting them to look. He's asking them to engage their own minds and experience and try to see the truth of what he's saying. And he then gets them to the point where they say, well, if there's no self in any of these skandhas, what's the point of clinging to them? What is the profit in it? What does it do for you? What do you get from it? Why don't you just leave it? Just drop it. Renounce it. And they all gain arahatva. So that's the text. And I hope you can see, at least in my understanding, just how much it tells us about what we are doing in our study groups, or what we are doing when we have a text, a scriptural text, or a commentary in front of us. I'm sure when we're translating a text, it's what we're doing. We can't just say, oh, this word means that word. We've got to try to get to the meaning behind it. And then, if you're a scholar, you have to make sure that the word that you use to translate that meaning is accurate to the original word, if you see what I mean. You can't just find your own nice equivalent. But when we engage with the Dhamma, when we study the Dhamma, whether alone or whether in a group, this is what we're doing. We're trying to get into connection with the Buddha. We could say that the Buddha is always trying to communicate with us, but we are cut off from him. So we're trying from our side to open up to the Buddha. We're trying, first of all, to have a certain receptivity of mind. I think it's extremely important. When we approach a text, we have to approach it with some faith that behind this text, despite the unfortunate manner of it, maybe the bad translation, etc., behind it is the voice of enlightenment. Somewhere back there is the voice of enlightenment. If we don't approach it in that way, we'll only approach it in the way of, as it were, intellectual understanding. We'll only be looking at it to see, well, this means that, that means that, this comes from there, that comes from there, this forms this pattern. We won't be listening for what's behind the words. Again, you remember the famous story of Tilopa, studying away, the foremost scholar at Nalanda, and he's visited by an old beggar woman who stands in front of him and says, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm reading. I'm reading the Dhamma." So she said, "Do you understand the words, or do you understand the meaning?" And that was it. That was his career at Ananda over. Off he went to the mountains. So we need to be making sure that we do understand the words, because if you don't understand the words, you won't get to the meaning. We have to be understanding the words as revealing a meaning, which is a meaning within the enlightened mind, if you see what I mean. So we have to be having that attitude and approaching it from that point of view, so that we're willing to accept that somewhere behind it all is the voice of enlightenment. I was very struck by this, by something Bhante said in that first of the conversations, What is the Western Buddhist Order?, where somebody asked him, do you expect your disciples to accept what you say? And Bhante's response was, there's Bhante. He said, I don't expect them to accept what I say, but I do expect them to take me seriously. There's something that I'm saying. He didn't say that, but that's what it comes down to. Even when he doesn't maybe get it quite right, or get it quite right in your terms, there's something that he's saying, something that he's communicating. So I think one has to approach the Dhamma text in that sort of way, with a sense that behind it is the voice of the Buddha. As I've said, sometimes that voice is quite obscured to us because of the infelicity of the translation, because of sometimes the rather awkward style of the sutta itself, which is very formulaic, it's ordered for recitation. Sometimes, of course, actually quite late suttas and sutras have importations into them that are a bit misleading and misguiding. So we have to get through all of that. Of course, if we're approaching a commentary, we're approaching a commentary by somebody who may be enlightened, maybe not, but who is themselves trying to get to grips with the voice of the Buddha, or rather get to listen to the voice of the Buddha. So we've got lots between us and the voice of the Buddha, as if there wasn't enough already. We're trying to listen through all this cloud, as it were, of the words and the form that it comes in. And our job in study is to start with the confidence that there is something behind it all, and that we're trying to sort out what that is. We're trying to sort of put aside the what's the word for it? The white noise and the disruption, and try to get to the pure voice of the Dhamma. I think it's where scholars really help, because they can fine-tune. They can say, well, this word, as it's translated here, is perhaps only part of the meaning. It has this meaning as well, and it comes from this root, it comes in this context. So then suddenly the word is expanded. And they can also say that, well, this is quite frankly known to be a quite late text. It was created under such and such circumstances. It's about this polemic in Buddhism, and they can disentangle it in that way. It doesn't mean that debunks it. We should be very clear about that. I mean, for instance, not being able to accept what Bhante says does not mean not accepting that Bhante's got something to say, if you see what I mean. So it's the same. The text itself maybe has things in it that you find difficult to accept because they come from elsewhere or whatever. Or you have to also be open to the possibility that there's things in it that you can't accept because you're wrong, because you've got wrong views. So this is the next thing that we have to take into account. The two really go together, don't they? In the case of the Vinaya account of the Dhammachakkha Pavatana occasion, the clearing up of views takes place before the real development of faith, of respect. But they're sort of connected because the views stop us from respecting. So clear in the sutta. They can't respect the Buddha because he does not conform to their idea of the spiritual life. We've all done it. Because somebody, Bhante, whatever, does not conform to our idea of the spiritual life, we do not listen to them. So these two go very much together. We need to get rid of our wrong views. Now, a lot of study is to do with getting rid of wrong views. And people have so many views. I'm going to talk about views later, the horrible beast. But this is the next function of study, is to clear away wrong views, or rather the next thing we need in order to study is to be setting aside wrong views, be prepared to have our views challenged and put them aside. Sometimes they need to be challenged very gently, sometimes they need to be challenged very bluntly. And we've got some very skilled view challengers, even here. And one has to be prepared to have those views challenged, because views are the subject of attachment. Views are one of the Trishna, Ditthi Tanha, Upadana Tanha, Upadana Ditthi. So we crave views because they make us secure. They're part of our defense system against reality. Inadequate as they are and hopelessly pain delivering, we still cling to them desperately because they make us feel secure. So if your views are really challenged, you're going to feel uncomfortable. You should feel uncomfortable, and it's okay to feel uncomfortable, because then you'll be free of the view. Then, of course, they open up to the Buddha, and they listen to him with attentive ears, and they understand what he's saying. And it's interesting because the text seems to be a sort of sequence. Stream entry first by means of recognition of the Four Noble Truths, to which the realization is of what arises ceases, and then to arahatva by recognizing the emptiness of the skandhas, the anatta nature of the skandhas. So there's a sort of order, a sort of progression there, and that maybe we shouldn't make too much of it, but it does suggest that one needs to get things in the right order. There's a sort of regular steps in Dharma study. In other words, let's not rush after the highest teachings when we ourselves are at the lowest level, because what we will then bring to those highest teachings is our low level of understanding, and we will fit them into that level of understanding, therefore distort them and mistake them. Often mistaking our intellectual apprehension for realization. And I think that is a danger amongst us. Intellectual apprehension these days is not so hard. We're a smart, well-educated bunch. But intellectual apprehension does not mean attainment. So we need to make sure that we've got the foundations firm and clear, and then we can see the truth at its highest level. So these are the points I want to draw from the text. I think it tells us what we're doing in study. We're trying to listen for the voice of the Buddha. In order to listen to the voice of the Buddha, we've got to clear away our wrong views, and we've got to open ourselves with faith to the text as somewhere within it containing the voice of the Buddha or of his enlightened disciples. And that is the idea of study. We're engaging with it so that we gain stream entry, arahatva. That's what it's about. So from merely listening attentively and understanding, we need to pass to a direct experience. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. So that's the idea of study. Now I was thinking that we might add to Coleridge's distinction a third, maybe arguably doesn't fit entirely, but why not, which is the archetype of a thing, which is the sort of the pattern existing not on an intellectual level, but at the level of imagination. What is the archetype of Dhamma study? What occurred to me first was that wonderful occasion where the Buddha is said to have plucked a white lotus and held it up, and Kashyapa understood. In fact, this comes from a quite late Chan source. It's nothing before the 11th century, so it's probably a Chinese creation, but it doesn't mean it's not spiritually true, if you see what I mean. And it's famous in Chinese, and I'm sure Shraddharpa will be able to make the characters for it. It's 4 characters: a pluck flower, subtle smile. And in a way, that's the archetype of Dhamma study. The flower of the Dhamma is held up. There's a subtle smile of realization. But that satisfied me to some extent, but and it also it makes it clear that Dhamma study in a way begins to fade into meditation and into symbol. I think Dhamma study, most pure, its chemically pure form, is mainly about concept and words and texts, although the texts may themselves contain symbols. But it is important to recognize that the Dhamma can be communicated through symbols. I mean, for instance, through visual symbols, visual Dhamma, famously called in that publication from San Francisco. But I thought a more satisfying archetype of Dhamma study, certainly for me, but maybe for all of us, is Manjushri. And Bhante was especially pleased that we put the image of Manjushri here in this atrium of the library, because he saw Manjushri as presiding, so to speak, over the communication of the Dhamma. That's what he represents. He represents the pure communication of the Dhamma. So, I do the Manjushri Stuti Sadhana, and every day I study with Manjushri. And I can say at times it literally is that. I get teachings from Manjushri. Not that he says something, but through my interaction with him, particularly through the stuti entering my heart, I see things. I understand things. So I think that you can say the archetype of Dhamma study is a meeting with Manjushri, who is the voice of the Buddha, the gentle voice of the Buddha. That's what he represents. And when we think of Dhamma study, we can think of it in all these terms. We can think of it in factual terms, just what you do, how it's organized, how you sit, what text you have. We can think of it in its ideal terms as this attempt, idea, a term, in the sense of opening up with faith, clearing away wrong views, so that you're receptive to the voice of the Buddha, which you hear within the text. And we can think of it in terms of the archetype of Dhamma study, which is the meeting with the Buddha, maybe the meeting with the Buddha in the form of Manjushri, who is the archetype of wisdom. So I hope this has some light to shed on your study together. I don't suppose it's anything particularly new to any of you, but just to bring these things out into the shared culture is important, I think, that we hear them together and reflect on them together, and I'm sure that will make a difference to study. Doesn't mean that study should not be hard fought. You know what I mean? I think there's a middle way between over-credulity and over-skepticism. I think you can be over-skeptical insofar as you just will not listen for that voice of reality. And you can be over-credulous in that you hear the voice of reality in everything, even when it's not there. Famously in India, if you leave a stone beside the road and paint it orange, everybody will come and worship it. It's a well-known story of a lady who wanted to go bathing, so she left her shoes by the side of the stream, and she put a stone on top of them so nobody would take them. When she got back, people were worshipping the stone. So that, if you like, is the archetype of credulity. Andhashraddha, a blind belief. So we don't want that, the same time, we want our questioning, our skepticism in the sincere sense, to be always based on a faith, on the faith that somewhere at the back of it, in this text, is the voice of the Buddha. And I think if we do that, we'll get so much from the text that we're studying. Thank you very much.